Every American schoolbook used to tell the same story. The first people reached this continent around 13,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge from Siberia. For nearly a century, that was the settled history of America. But in a remote corner of New Mexico, park rangers kept noticing something strange. Human footprints that appeared after rain and vanished as the ground dried. When scientists finally dated those footprints, the answer was so extreme that experts across the country said it had to be wrong. 23,000 years old, 10,000 years too early. This is the story of the footprints that were called impossible, and the 3 laboratories that proved they were real. White Sands National Park sits in the Tularosa Basin of southern New Mexico, about 15 miles southwest of the town of Alamogordo. Today it is the largest gypsum dune field on Earth, blinding white sand stretching to the horizon, one of the driest, emptiest landscapes in America. But the ground here keeps a secret. Around 2005, a wildlife scientist named David Bustos took a job at the park. Almost immediately, the older staff told him about something they called the ghost tracks, footprints, human footprints, and the prints of enormous animals, but they behaved unlike anything in a normal dig site. When the ground held just the right amount of moisture, the tracks would appear, dark outlines against the pale gypsum, and when the ground dried, they would fade away again, visible one day, gone the next. For years, nobody could say how old they were. Some assumed they were recent. Others thought a few thousand years at most. The prints were dismissed as a curiosity, something interesting for the rangers, but not for science. Then nature intervened. A rare flood filled the ancient lakebed. Waves beat against a shoreline that had been dry for thousands of years, eroding the sediment and exposing trackways that no living person had ever seen. Bustos began finding them everywhere. The enormous round prints of mammoths, the strange, oversized prints of giant ground sloths, and in between them, long, narrow impressions, with heels, with arches, with toes. Bustos knew what he was looking at. He just couldn't prove it. So the park reached out to one of the few people on Earth who could. Matthew Bennett, a scientist at Bournemouth University in England, who has spent his career studying one thing: fossil footprints. Bennett arrived in 2017, examined the prints, and confirmed it. These were human, but the ghost tracks were, in his word, mercurial. A trackway that was sharp and clear on Monday could be invisible by Friday. Some days the team couldn't even find prints they had already documented, so they brought in ground-penetrating radar, a technology that let them see the buried tracks without ever touching the ground. In the areas they surveyed, it detected roughly 96% of the hidden human prints beneath the surface. The question was no longer whether the footprints were real. The question was, how old? The answer began on a September day in 2019. Bustos and Bennett went out to a low bluff in the park's restricted backcountry, a spot they had already visited more than a dozen times. Nothing about that day was supposed to be special, but overnight, the wind had done what no shovel had. It had stripped away a layer of sand and uncovered a line of unmistakably human footprints, walking straight into the base of a small mound. The team scraped back the sandy layer, and underneath, sealed inside the old lake sediments, the trackway continued. This changed everything. Footprints on the surface can't be dated, wind and water have moved them too many times. But footprints sealed inside layers of earth are different. Each layer above and below them is a page in a calendar. Date the layers, and you date the feet that walked between them. An international team assembled: the National Park Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, Bournemouth University, Cornell. They opened a careful excavation, roughly the size of half a basketball court. What they found inside was not one trackway. It was 61 human footprints pressed into 8 separate layers of ancient earth, one above another. Not one visit, not one family. Generations of people, returning to the same shoreline, again and again. And when the team studied the size and shape of those 61 prints, they found something no one expected. Most of them were made by children. The analysis showed the prints belonged to as many as 16 individuals. And the age group that appears most often is teenagers and children, roughly 9 to 14 years old. Small heels, small arches, small toes, pressed into the mud of an ancient lakeshore. The researchers offered a simple, human explanation. In hunter-gatherer groups, adults did the skilled work. The fetching and carrying, that was the job of teenagers. And wherever teenagers went, younger children followed, playing, splashing, leaving far more footprints than any careful adult ever would. The tracks even preserve moments. In one place, human prints step directly inside the tracks of a giant ground sloth, an animal the size of a small car, with long, curved claws. The sloth's own prints show it rearing up and swinging in defensive circles, while human feet approach on tiptoe. A hunt, frozen in the ground. Elsewhere in the park, a separate and younger trackway, dated to roughly 11 to 13,000 years ago, records a small woman, or perhaps a teenage boy, walking almost a mile across the wet flats while carrying a toddler on one hip. You can see where the child was set down for a moment. You can see the return journey hours later, this time with no toddler prints at all. But the 61 footprints in those 8 sealed layers were the real prize, because they could be dated. And within the layers, the team found their first clock, seeds. Thousands of tiny seeds from an aquatic plant called rupia, ditchgrass, lay in the same thin bands of clay as the footprints. Seeds are organic. Organic material can be radiocarbon dated. The team ran 11 separate samples, taken from above, below, and between the footprint layers. In September 2021, the results were published in the journal Science. The seeds bracketed the footprints to between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. To understand why that number caused such an uproar, you need one piece of context. 23,000 years ago was the peak of the last ice age, what scientists call the last glacial maximum. 2 massive ice sheets sealed off the entire top of North America. According to the accepted story, no one could have walked into this continent during that window. The door was frozen shut. Yet here were human footprints, deep inside New Mexico, at exactly that time. The reaction came fast, and to be fair to the critics, their objection was not stubbornness. It was real science. Rupia is an aquatic plant. It grows underwater, and instead of taking its carbon from the air, it can absorb ancient carbon dissolved in groundwater, carbon that may have been locked in the rock for thousands of years. That makes the plant's radiocarbon clock read too old. Scientists call it the hard water effect. A group of respected researchers published a formal challenge. They pointed to a striking test case. Rupia, collected alive from a spring near White Sands in 1947, had returned a radiocarbon age of about 7,400 years, a living plant, dating as ancient. Their conclusion: the footprints might really be only around 13 to 15,000 years old. Remarkable, but not history-changing. The White Sands team didn't dismiss the criticism, they did something better. They went looking for a clock that couldn't lie the same way. They found it in pollen. Ancient pine, spruce, and fir trees had grown around the old lake, and unlike rupia, trees take their carbon directly from the atmosphere. No groundwater, no hard water effect. But there was a catch. To radiocarbon date pollen, you need enormous amounts of it. So the team used chemical processing and a cell sorting technology called flow cytometry to isolate roughly 75,000 individual pollen grains for a single sample. They did this for samples taken from the exact same layers as the seeds. The pollen returned its verdict. Roughly 22 to 23,000 years old, statistically indistinguishable from the seeds. And they didn't stop there. They added a second, completely different kind of clock, optically stimulated luminescence. This method doesn't measure carbon at all. It measures the last time individual grains of quartz sand saw sunlight, the luminescence result. The footprint layers were buried at least 21,500 years ago. In October 2023, the U.S. Geological Survey published both results in Science. Seeds said 23,000, pollen said 23,000, light-dated quartz agreed. Still, some doubt remained. So in June 2025, a third study arrived, led by Vance Holliday of the University of Arizona. This time the material was the humblest one imaginable: mud. Ancient lake mud from layers that connect directly into the footprint-bearing ground. 26 new radiocarbon dates, and critically, the samples were run by 2 laboratories completely independent of the original team. The mud answered 20,700 to 22,400 years old. Step back and look at what the record now shows. 3 different materials, seeds, pollen, mud, 3 fundamentally different dating approaches. Separate laboratories working independently, and across all of it, 55 radiocarbon dates telling one consistent story. For the skeptics to be right, every one of those clocks would have to be broken, and broken in the same direction, by the same amount. The Geological Survey put it plainly, with 3 separate lines of evidence pointing to the same approximate age, it is highly unlikely that they are all incorrect or biased. Holliday said it in more human terms. It would be, in his words, Serendipity in the extreme, for so many dates to line up so perfectly and all be wrong. Even the debate itself became a model of how science should work. One outside archaeologist called the team's answer to its critics a masterclass in how to respond to scientific criticism. No anger, no accusations, just better evidence, 3 times over. The footprints held. So what breaks if the footprints are real? The old timeline breaks. The Clovis First model, the idea that the earliest Americans arrived around 13,000 years ago through an opening between the ice sheets, cannot explain people standing in New Mexico 10,000 years earlier, and here is the detail that closes the argument. Recent research indicates that the inland ice-free corridor was likely impassable until roughly 13,800 years ago. If people were already in New Mexico at 23,000, they did not come through that door. It wasn't open yet. Which points somewhere else. The Pacific coast. Many researchers now argue the first Americans may have moved south along the shoreline, by foot and by boat, skirting the edge of the ice long before the interior route existed. And there is one more group for whom this evidence carries a different kind of weight. Many Native American nations have said, for generations, that their people have been on this land far longer than the textbooks allowed. Since time immemorial. When members of the Pueblo of Acoma saw the trackways, one of them said simply, "These tracks trace back to us." The children who ran along that vanished lakeshore lived in a world we can barely picture. Where the white dunes stand today, there was water, Lake Otero, covering as much as 1,600 square miles. Around it, cool grasslands and conifer forests stretched for miles. Mammoths and ancient camels grazed the shore. Dire wolves and American lions hunted them. And through it all walked families, leaving nothing behind but their footsteps. When the Ice Age ended, the lake evaporated. The wind ground its gypsum bed into brilliant white sand and buried the footprints for 200 centuries. Is the case completely closed? Honestly, not for everyone. A few careful scientists, including Michael Waters of Texas A&M, still ask whether even the mud dates could carry traces of that old groundwater carbon, and one genuine mystery remains. If people lived here 23,000 years ago, where are their tools, their campsites? Not a single artifact has been found beside the tracks. Holliday's answer is practical. Many of these trackways record only a few seconds of walking, and no traveler drops precious stone tools in the middle of a wet flat, far from any place to replace them. The wind, he admits, has already erased part of the story, and that part may be gone forever. But somewhere under those white dunes, more layers are waiting, more ghost tracks, and perhaps one day, the campfire that ends the debate for good. Because the footprints have already survived the Ice Age, the desert, and 20,000 years of wind, they can survive a little more doubt. If stories like this one, real discoveries hidden in the ground beneath our feet, are your kind of history, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, what do you think the ghost tracks will reveal next?